Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan with another of our Double Shot interviews, and I'm joined by Ryan Greenaway-McGrevy, who is a senior lecturer in economics at the University of Auckland. Welcome in, Ryan. Good to see you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Ryan's here to talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, so the TPPA as it's known. He's been working on a series of articles for us about what's actually in the agreement, what it means and what isn't in the agreement. Pretty big undertaking, Ryan. We appreciate your efforts. It's proving very interesting. I guess, first of all, can I ask you the overarching theme? What is the overarching theme of this TPPA?
So I guess the central idea of the agreement is to put firms that are domiciled or operating within that TPP block of countries on a level footing, on a level playing field. So, for example, New Zealand laws and regulations would have to treat a US firm supplying goods to New Zealand the same as a New Zealand firm supplying those same goods and services to New Zealand. And the flip side of that, the quid pro quo, is that a New Zealand firm operating in the US would have to be treated the same as a US firm. Okay. So that concept of a level playing field is applied to a variety of economic activities: trade in goods, trade in services, and trade in investments. If we thought about trade in goods, we could think about a New Zealand firm exporting fruits and vegetables to the US, right? And so in order for them to be on a level playing field with a US firm supplying fruits and vegetables, they would not have to be impeded by, say, tariffs or other barriers to trade. And vice versa, a US manufacturer, say, exporting building materials to New Zealand, they would not be impeded by tariffs and other barriers to trade in order to put them on a level playing field with our domestic manufacturers.
Okay. Now, there's obviously a lot of talk around, all the countries, the signatories to this agreement, actually ratifying it, signing it, and the processes are a little different everywhere. The one that is in the news the most is the US. Obviously, we've got presidential elections going on there this year. Congress will have to approve it, etc., etc. What are the dangers that it doesn't get ratified? When will we sort of actually know whether it will get ratified, and I guess what will it mean if it doesn't?
So I guess a bit of background on the ratification process is in order for it to go ahead, a minimum of 6 countries have to ratify it, and the countries that do ratify it, they have to comprise at least 85% of the total GDP of the trading bloc. So if the US doesn't ratify it, it's a massive economy, then it's not going through. So in terms of the timeline, there's a lot of talk out there on the internet that says this would have to be put forward to the Congress before the elections in November, because after that, politicians are in their campaigning mode. The TPPA is obviously a very controversial issue, and so anyone that comes out and supports it is going to face a lot of flack and may not be re-elected.
Okay, so it's a bit of a watch this space, really.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, one of the, more interesting, controversial areas is the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, so between member countries. I guess one of the big issues that opponents of the plan in New Zealand have here is concerns that we're ceding sovereignty to foreign corporations. Is there any truth in that?
So it's not the case that we're ceding sovereignty to foreign corporations, but we are ceding sovereignty to an international court, right? So the defining aspect of the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism is that a firm can, if it has a dispute with a host government, it will take that dispute to a foreign domiciled court. So not true that we're ceding sovereignty to corporations, but it does mean that we're giving up some sovereignty.
So we could see more legal challenges?
We could see more legal challenges. That is always a possibility. We've had, these ISDS mechanisms in place under some of our other free trade agreements for a while now. New Zealand has not been challenged so far, but there is a lot of concern that, we're opening the door up further to a broader suite of potential suitors. Sorry, people making suits. And so that we could possibly see lawsuits coming our way, but it's unclear. There is a lot of language in the TPPA that says that a country can continue to legislate in the interests of environmental safety and in the interests of the health and safety of its citizens. But we've also seen examples, say under NAFTA, where the Canadian government has backed down from enacting environmental legislation and health and safety legislation because of the threat of a lawsuit from a foreign investor. So we don't know, ultimately, until it's in place.
The environment is an interesting issue. You wrote an article about the environment chapter in there, and you noted that in the whole agreement there's no mention of climate change or global warming, which is quite interesting in this day and age. I guess the question there is, should even those of us who aren't die-in-the-ditch greenies be concerned about this?
So, I mean, there are surveys out there looking at attitudes towards global warming, climate change in New Zealand, around the world, and the vast majority of New Zealanders think that man-made climate change is a potential threat, with the implication being that we should do something about it. Right, so the remaining question really is a trade agreement the appropriate place to address climate change? And I would argue that the answer is yes. Right now, what we want to have are economic incentives that actually support action on climate change. And right now we don't have that. Right now we live in a world in which a country loses money if it does something about climate change. What we'd rather have is a world in which a country loses money if it doesn't do something about it. So what happens when a country unilaterally addresses climate change? Usually this involves taxing fossil fuels, pushes up the price of energy. The next thing that happens is a lot of manufacturers, energy-intensive sectors of the economy shut down, you lose jobs, and that production moves overseas to other countries that aren't cracking down on fossil fuel use, right? So in the end, you've shrunk your economy and you're still consuming those goods that have a high carbon footprint. The difference is you're just importing them from overseas. And we've seen that happen. It's happened in Europe. Europe was one of the few signatories to the Kyoto Protocol that actually adhered to what they promised to do, brought down those carbon emissions domestically. But then they just began importing more and more products from the US, from China, from emerging economies that were heavily dependent on fossil fuels. And so if you look at the CO2 emissions that Europeans are responsible for, they actually far exceed the emissions that are happening in Europe itself, right? So, taking unilateral action on climate change, it's the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, you're punishing your domestic industry, your domestic manufacturers, you're losing jobs, and it's not clear that you're actually solving the problem either, right? You end up in a world in which, those CO2 emissions are still being produced, they're just not being produced at home, they're being produced overseas, right? So if we're going to get serious about climate change, we really have to recognise the role that trade plays in enabling it and indeed exacerbating it, and a trade agreement is the place to do it.
Okay. You've also written about, the balancing act between getting market access for our exporters to, giving other countries greater access to the New Zealand market and the potential for biological threats. One we had not far from here recently was the Queensland fruit fly. How much of a balancing act is this in terms of, getting New Zealand access and giving up access here, and what are the opportunities and the dangers in that?
Yeah, it's a difficult balancing act, right? If you want to ensure that you never have a foreign pathogen come into your country, just close the borders down. And of course, you'll achieve one goal, but at the expense of the greater economy. So is there wiggle room? Can we, at the same time, open our borders and ensure that we do a good job policing these pathogens? It is a difficult balancing act, but ultimately it comes down to the infrastructure that's in place and how much money the government's willing to put into monitoring and ensuring that these pathogens can't make it here.
You've also written that the great economic reforms in New Zealand in the 1980s and 90s that were massive upheaval for the country at the time have positioned us a lot better than some of the other signatories for the TPPA. The freer trade of the TPPA. Yeah. I'd be interested if you could just expand on that a little bit.
So, opening up to trade can be really painful for an economy, right? As soon as you open up to trade, there are winners and losers, and in terms of the composition of the economy, usually when a developed nation opens up to trade, it's the manufacturing sector that dies off, right? And the other sectors can grow. So we've seen this in the US, for example. The manufacturing is still on the decline in the US and has been for a very long time. Now, what's unique about New Zealand is that in the 1980s we unilaterally opened up to trade. And at the time, people said this was perhaps foolish. We're giving up a few bargaining chips when it comes to trade negotiations, which is true to an extent. But what it has done is that it means that we have gone through that structural pain already. Our manufacturing sector has already shrunk. The manufacturers that survived that upheaval have learnt to compete in the global marketplace and compete with cheap imports. So really, we shouldn't see too many job losses. We shouldn't see much of a massive restructuring of the economy because of the TPPA.
Yeah, we've already taken our medicine, I guess. And
exactly, yeah.
Some other countries are going to be going through what we went through back then.
Exactly. So you look at the manufacturing sector in the US, a lot of the labour unions are not happy with the TPPA, and because they know it means that it'll mean further job losses in certain sectors of their economy.
And hence the political pressure over there.
Exactly. So it's like here, it's a controversial issue there as well, but for us, there isn't really the threat of massive job losses anymore. It's more these other issues like investor-state dispute settlement that make some people uncomfortable.
What about intellectual property? That's another area we've heard a lot about, I guess, through the development of the TPPA and the leaks that came out during the development of it. What's it going to mean for intellectual property?
So for New Zealand, we shouldn't see a lot of changes in our intellectual property laws. Right? There'll be a slight increase in copyright on artistic originals, a little bit of an increase in the data protection on biological medicines. But for us, what was revealed in those leaks is that the US backed down on a lot of their demands. So for a country like New Zealand, the fact that they backed down to a level that's we're already providing within existing laws. Now, the same can't be said for a lot of emerging or developing nations that have far lower protections of IP. They're going to have to increase their protections on intellectual property. This may affect, it is going to affect the price of medicine, for example, in these countries.
Now, this is a huge agreement, and I think you're up to about 10 articles thus far that you've written for us on various chapters of it. What else is still to come?
So, yes, what else? So we're going to revisit the investment chapter. We've looked at the investor-state dispute settlement part of that chapter, but we're going to go back and look at investment in general, sort of have an eye on what it means for foreign investment in property, which is obviously a hot topic in New Zealand at the moment. We'll look at implications of the TPPA on the Treaty of Waitangi. And then there's a whole lot of stuff where I'll be trying to make it as interesting as possible. There are still chapters related to, say, trade remedies, what you can do if you have a dispute and the dispute is settled and the country that you had the dispute with still refuses to comply. Then things can get quite interesting, retaliatory tariffs and so forth. And obviously there are probably another 15 chapters that we still have to cover.
So plenty still to go. We'll look forward to hearing about that in the coming weeks.
Cool.
Thanks a lot for that. That's Ryan Greenaway-McGrevy from the University of Auckland, and I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz.